Hey everybody, Dave here, and today I've got a little bit of a sneak peek preview at the new and upcoming Player Core Remaster and GM Core Remaster books for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. If you've been following this channel for a while, you've probably seen my previews before. The way I usually do them is by sharing pages from the book, by sharing the table of contents, by doing a broad overview of page counts and that sort of thing, as well as giving a little bit of an overview of the highlights. For these remaster books, I'm going to do it a little bit different because the majority of the concept is going to be very familiar. If you have the core rulebook, if you have the game mastery guide for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, then you largely already know what is in the books and how they function. And instead, for this video, what I thought I would do is solicit questions from the community about whatever aspects of these two new books are most curious to them, and providing answers to those questions. And that's exactly what I did. I posted on both my Patreon as well as to Reddit, and a lot of folks out there were kind enough to offer their questions and the things that they're most interested in learning about the new books. And I'm going to go over a number of those with you today. Now, I do want to do a couple of disclaimers. First of all, I should let you know that I was provided copies of these books by Paizo. And also, I'm not going to be able to go over literally every one of the questions that was posed to me. Some of them were just not applicable. For example, there were a lot of questions that were specific to either the champion or monk classes, and those, surprisingly, are not included in Player Core 1. Instead, we will have to wait until Player Core 2 to get the new write-ups for those classes. And also, some of the questions that were asked were things that, frankly, I'm going to have to do a lot of analysis to really formulate an opinion on. And some other items were just simply things that I couldn't get a definite yes-no answer when I looked them up. And so, again, I might take a little more time to do a little more digging with the materials that have been provided before answering those questions. But don't worry, there's still a lot for us to cover today. So with that all in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the first question that was asked, and it's all about recall knowledge. We have heard that recall knowledge is going to change, and now finally in Player Core 1, we have the new write-up for recall knowledge. Essentially, what the change is they're adapting a common house rule that I already used in my games, and I know a lot of other people did as well, where instead of taking the original rules, which said that you gave the most commonly known fact about an item or a monster that's being identified or something like that with recall knowledge, instead we are turning it now. In the new system, your player is going to ask you one specific question. They're not going to say, I want to do recall knowledge on this Wendigo. They might say, I'm going to do recall knowledge, and I would like to know if the Wendigo is weak to fire. So it's going to be one question they ask, and then the GM's going to make a secret skill check for that person's recall knowledge check. And if it is a success, then they're going to answer that question. If it is a failure, nothing happens. If it's a critical failure, the GM is going to give them a false bit of information. And if it's a critical success, then the GM is going to answer that question and either expound on it with more related adjacent information, or might just allow them to ask a second question as well. So in a nutshell, that's how recall knowledge is working now. No more do we have to worry about the mystery of figuring out, well, what would be the most commonly known trait or aspect of whatever recall knowledge is being applied to, and instead the onus is on the player to ask us a specific question that they want answered. So the second question was all about states of awareness and stealth. Have there been any meaningful material changes to those? And from an overview and reading of those pieces in the player core, I do not see any meaningful material changes that are applied to any of the states of awareness or to stealth. Moving on is kind of a big one, and I'm going to have to kind of divide it into a number of different parts, and these are all about the new damage types. So how do vitality and void work? How do holy and unholy damage work? And how does spirit damage work? So first up, vitality and void damage. As far as I can tell, they are pretty much just one-to-one correspondence to the positive and negative damage types that we already had. Vitality damage will only harm undead, and the opposite is true. Void damage will only harm the living. Then holy and unholy. So holy and unholy damage types in the holy and unholy traits are largely replacing the mechanical side of alignments. So if you haven't heard the big news in the Pathfinder 2nd Edition Remaster, alignments are a thing of the past. And so there's still a mechanical need, especially for divine characters, to be able to apply some sort of additional effect when they're fighting fiends and evil doers and so forth. But we can't say evil doer anymore because evil is not a mechanical concept anymore. So first thing you need to know is there is this thing called being sanctified and sanctification. When you are when you choose to play a cleric, and this is really in player core 1, the only area where this comes into effect. We'll have to wait for player core 2 to see how sanctification applies to champions and potentially other classes. But if you are a cleric, you must choose a god you worship, and that god is going to have some manner of sanctification listing in their little write-up in the rulebook. And so that is either going to say that the clerics that follow that god must be sanctified as holy or must be sanctified as unholy, or it could say that the cleric is required to choose one of those two, or it may say that the cleric can choose one of those two. If a cleric follows a god where the sanctification listing says that they can choose either holy or unholy, that means that they can also choose none of the above and not be sanctified. But in general, good aligned, so to speak, deities are going to require their followers or their clerics, to be specific, to be holy. Evil deities are probably going to ask that their clerics be unholy, and neutral in other French cases. It could be you get to choose if you want to be holy or unholy, or you get to choose either of those or say none of the above. But provided you are sanctified, then you gain the holy trait or you gain the unholy trait. Now, this also applies to casting spells and other damaging effects. So, holy affects anything with the unholy trait. So, this is typically going to be fiends of every variety, demons, devils, so forth. If it is a fiend, it will probably have the unholy trait, and most undead will also most likely have the unholy trait. So if you're dealing holy damage, it's going to apply to most likely to fiends, to undead, but also to anything that has the unholy trait, which would include a cleric of a previously defined evil deity. And the opposite of that is also going to be true. Unholy damage is going to affect anything with the holy trait, which are typically going to be celestials like angels, as well as any creatures with the holy trait, such as the cleric to a good aligned deity. Also, there are a number of different spells and other effects that say if the target has either the holy or unholy trait, is going to do this extra effect as well. Now, the third type of damage is spirit damage. So, spirit damage, as the name implies, it damages the spirit of a creature. So, this is not inherently living or undead, because a ghost is a spirit. It most likely has a spirit and could be affected by spirit damage. But this damage is not affecting the physical body, it's affecting the soul. So, one example that the book points out is that if a creature is possessed by another being and you deal spirit damage to them, then it's not the physical possessed person who is hurt, it's going to be the person doing the possessing who is harmed, because it's their spirit who is in control of that possessed body. And constructs are going to be immune to this kind of damage because they don't have spirits typically. So the next question that kind of is building onto that is about holy and unholy runes. Do we have magical runes for those new damage types? And yes, we do. Holy runes deal an extra 1d4 spirit damage to a weapon attack that has a holy rune, or 2d4 against enemies with the unholy trait. Also, once per day after critically succeeding on a strike against an unholy target, the wielder can spend their reaction to heal themselves double the target's level. Unholy creatures are going to be enfeebled too whenever carrying or wielding a weapon that has a holy rune etched upon it. And unholy runes are going to function pretty much exactly the same way, except they don't heal on those critical hits once per day. Instead, they're going to apply bleed damage once per day to a holy target that they critically succeed their strikes against. So next question. Is there a way to get the holy and unholy traits other than being a cleric? I did not see any other ways in the player core book to apply sanctification and gain the holy and unholy traits outside of being a cleric by class or taking the cleric multi-class dedication feat, which requires you to undergo sanctification in the exact same way as a regular cleric. You still have to choose a god and apply either holy or unholy, or none of the above if you get that option. I was a little surprised by that. I was expecting there to be some other method within the game to gain those traits. For example, the Nephilim, which is sort of the catch-all ancestry for outsiders or people who have an outsider heritage in their bloodline. So tieflings and Aasimar and so on and so forth. In the new book are all gathered together under the heading of Nephilim. And even though it writes about, like, if you have an infernal ancestry, or what would used to have been called a tiefling, people look at you and see horns and hooves, and they might assume you have the unholy trait. But I didn't see anything in that write-up that gave a path to earning either the holy or unholy trait. All right, so moving on, I got a question about consecration and the consecrate ritual. So the consecration trait is unchanged, as far as I can tell, from the Legacy Pathfinder 2nd edition rules, but the consecrate ritual has been adjusted to account for holy and unholy traits. And it now has a part of it that reads as follows. If your deity's divine sanctification allows you to choose holy or unholy, you can choose to make the consecrated site holy or unholy as well. If the deity's sanctification must be holy or unholy, you must make the site match that sanctification. And it adds, strikes made by worshippers of your deity within the area gain the site's sanctification trait, if any. So if you perform the Consecrate ritual and you are following a holy god and you have been sanctified as being holy, then that area of the consecration is going to have the holy trait applied to that area, and any followers of your god in that area, regardless if they're clerics or not, or if they have the holy trait or not, all those followers within that area, if they follow your god, will have the holy trait applied to their strikes and their attacks against enemies within that area. So, next question is about focus points in the focus pool. Are focus pools still capped at 3? Yes, there is still a hard cap of a maximum of 3 focus points, but you can use the refocus activity every 10 minutes without limitation. So, in the original Pathfinder 2nd Edition rules, you could refocus for 10 minutes, but you could only do that if you had spent at least 1 focus point since the last time you refocused. And so that would prevent someone from taking a 30-minute break after a fight and getting all 3 of their points back and having them all available for the next fight. That rule was more than a little confusing to a number of people, so they've simplified it in the Remaster edition, and now that language is removed from Refocus. It no longer has that limitation. So now if you do have 30 minutes, you can spend all 30 minutes and refocus 3 times in a row and get all 3 of your focus points back, but 3 points is still the listed maximum for focus points. The next couple questions are all dealing with the layout of the book. Is it more user-friendly? Is it easier to navigate around? Does it look nice? So, first of all, yeah, I think it looks very nice. Second of all, it is a little easier to navigate around, but I don't think the changes are so material and wide-sweeping that I would go so far as to say that it's fundamentally an easier layout and book for new players. If you want a layout that's going to be friendly for new people, then perhaps the beginner's box is still the place to look for that. But some of the things that they've done with the layout and presentation of the remaster books, first of all, they are using green as a dominant color, so it's easy to recognize what is a remaster book versus one of the original legacy rulebooks. They are also applying some more use of bold. There are some sidebars in the new book that have bolded words to stand out, whereas in the original version, those same sidebars did not. And the index has been improved, in my point of view, because, for example, the Player Core 1 not only includes all the index items that you would expect to find in a Player Core rulebook, but if there was something that was included in the core rulebook in the original release that has now been moved to GM Core, then the Player Core book has an index entry for those items, and it says, hey, that's not in this book anymore. You're going to want to go check out the GM Core, and it will give you the page number to the GM Core, which is super handy. A good example of this is runes. Runes are no longer found in the player book. Runes are now listed solely in the GM book, but because players might be looking for that information, the index in the Player Core book does direct them to the appropriate page in the GM Core rules, which I think was a great addition and well thought out. Next question is about shield runes. We heard that there were changes coming to shields, but what about shield runes? How are these going to function? Okay, so shields now have their own potency runes that are called reinforcing runes. Reinforcing runes increase the hardness, the hit points, and the break threshold, all 3 of them, for any shield that is etched with a reinforcing rune. Unlike potency runes for weapons and for armor, shield potency runes, these reinforcing runes, come in 6 varieties instead of 3. The first, it becomes available at 4th level, and then a new one every 3 levels after. So the 6 types of reinforcing runes are minor, lesser, moderate, greater, major, and supreme. Now, those are the potency runes for shields. However, at this time, I don't believe there are any potency runes for a shield. I didn't see any of those listed. That could be something that they plan to add later. I don't know. But for example, there's no like flaming shield runes and so forth. There are still plenty of just standard magical shields that apply different aspects similar to what we would achieve through potency runes or through property runes, excuse me. But as of right now, in this first release, no property runes for shields, only potency runes. They are called reinforcing runes. They increase hardness, hit points, and break threshold. So next question was, are there any changes to crafting? And yes, and there are changes that I am pretty excited about, that I like. These changes are going to alleviate some of the most common concerns about crafting, but if there's one thing I've learned running this channel is that there's a lot of people out there who just fundamentally hate the crafting rules in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. And for those folks, this may not fix all your problems. But here's what they've done to crafting. First of all, they have reduced the base time to craft from 4 days to only 2 days. So now you have to, it still works the same way. You still have to have half of the value of the item you want to craft in raw materials. You spend 2 days instead of 4 days setting up and beginning work and exhaust those that value, that half value of the price of the item you're crafting, and then make a skill check. And then after that, you can choose to either pay the remaining costs out of your pocket and finish immediately, or continue working additional days. And for every additional day spent crafting, you reduce the remaining budget by the amount found on the earn income table. That process is all the same. The difference is, instead of having to work 4 days before you can finish, you only have to work 2. Also, another big thing that changed is if what you are crafting is common rarity, then you do not need a formula for it. So you no longer have to have a formula to craft something if it is common rarity. Now, if you want to craft something that is not common rarity, then you either must have the formula for that item, or you must have an already crafted sample of that item. If I want to craft a magic weapon, and that magic weapon is uncommon rarity, I either need a formula for that weapon, or I need to have that weapon in front of me for me to examine and figure out and basically replicate. Now, here's the thing though. You no longer have to have a formula for common rarity, and you don't have to have a formula for uncommon and more rare as long as you have a sample to work off of. But if you do have the formula for what you're trying to craft, then the amount of time needed to craft it is further reduced from 2 days to only 1 day. So if you were to apply this logic to the original crafting rules, and you have the formula for whatever you're trying to craft, then it goes from being a minimum 4 days to a minimum 1 day of work. So I think that's going to make a lot of people happy out there, even if it doesn't fix all of the concerns that exist with crafting. Moving on, the next question is about Disarm. Did they fix the Disarm rules? And I can't objectively say if it is fixed or not, but they did improve. This did get a buff. And what they've done is they've removed the limitation that's listed in the write-up for Disarm that says until the start of that creature's turn. So In the original Disarm rules, if you succeeded, but not critically succeeded, on a disarm attempt, then you jar the item loose in your opponent's hand, and that gives you a +2 to future attempts to knock it out, which would require a critical success, and it imposes a -2 penalty to that person wanting to use it. But in the original rules, those penalties immediately went away at the start of that creature's next turn, which basically meant imposing the -2 to their attacks with the weapon you were trying to disarm. Completely useless, except if maybe they were going to get an opportunity attack, which is no longer called an attack of opportunity in this system. But I'm sure you get the idea. That's very limited use. The new version of Disarm just removes that language, and instead, the penalty that's applied to using an item that has been knocked loose by a disarm attempt persists until that person spends an action to interact with the weapon or whatever you're trying to remove from their grasp and fix their grip. So so when it comes to that character, that enemy's turn, they're going to have to make the decision. Do I want to attack with this and suffer a -2 to the attack, or do I want to sacrifice one of my 3 actions to re-grip the weapon properly and remove those penalties? So probably is not the fixed solution that some people want. It's not going back to the halcyon days of Pathfinder First Edition, but this is definitely a buff to disarm attempts. So next up, we have the Ruffian Rogue. And the Ruffian Rogue is something that they had hinted that there were changes coming for, so now they're here, so let's talk about them. This is going to deal with what weapons a Ruffian Rogue can use to make sneak attacks. In the original Legacy first release of Pathfinder 2nd Edition, that was limited to simple weapons. They could use simple weapons to make their sneak attacks, and that's been changed, and it now reads as the following. You can deal sneak attack damage with any weapon, not just the weapons listed in the sneak attack class feature. This benefit does not apply to a simple weapon with a damage die greater than D8, or a martial or advanced weapon with a damage die greater than D6. Apply any abilities that alter the damage die first. Critical hits you make with these weapons gain the weapon's critical specialization benefit if the target is off guard to you. Off guard, by the way, is the new term for flat-footed. So this is great. They're greatly expanding the weapons that a Ruffian Rogue can use to make sneak attacks with. However, there is a damage die cap. Again, for simple weapons, that cap is D8, and for martial or advanced weapons, that cap is at D6. So next is a question that by now, if you're on Reddit or following a number of my peers in the world of YouTube, you've probably heard an awful lot about, and that is wounded and dying. Did they clarify exactly when the wounded value is added to your dying condition value? And this goes back to inconsistencies in the original text, and also the beginner's box had areas where they said that the wounded condition only applies to or only increases your dying value at the moment you become unconscious. And there's other places that say that you add the wounded's value to your dying value every single time you either fail a recovery check while you're unconscious with the dying condition, or whenever you suffer additional damage while you have the dying condition. The good news is this has been clarified. The bad news is that I absolutely cannot fathom why they decided to go this way. But for whatever it's worth, the new official rules clearly specify that for recovery checks, the dying condition increases by 1 plus your wounded value on a failure, or 2 plus the wounded value on a critical failure. And also, your wounded value is added to your dying value every time you suffer additional damage while you have the dying condition. So, if you are wounded 1 and get knocked down into 0 hit points, you immediately go to dying 2. If you fail your first recovery check, that is going to increase by 1 for the failure and go from 2 to 3, but you're also going to apply your wounded condition value, again, taking you to 4. And Pathfinder 2nd Edition has been the most lethal D20 based RPG I've ever run. I have had more player deaths in this system than any others, so making it more deadly, more dangerous, more difficult to play. I have no clue why Paizo decided to go this way. If your goal is to scare away new players, this is an excellent way to do that. This is a great way to make sure people do not adopt and play your game. So that said, my house rule number 1 is I'm not doing that. I'm only applying the wounded value to the dying condition when a person gains the dying condition, and not after every single failed recovery check or when they suffer additional damage. The game is simply just lethal enough the way it is, and if I'm introducing new players to my game, I want to be a little more lenient with them making mistakes. And again, I am baffled, frankly baffled, by their decision to go this way, but that's what the new rule is. And our next question is about the Warrior Muse Bard. This question says that they mentioned that they were doing something to make it feel better, but we haven't heard anything since. Okay, so the Warrior Muse Bard, I did a cursory look at it, and I believe the changes have been applied to the martial performance feat, which all Warrior Muse Bards receive. The old version said you become trained with all martial weapons. If you gain the Bard Weapon Expertise class feature, your proficiency rank with martial weapons increases to Expert. Now, the new version of martial performance for the Warrior Muse Bards has been completely rewritten, and it now says when you have a Courageous Anthem composition cantrip active. So it's worth mentioning that Courageous Anthem is the new name for Inspire Courage. So this is sort of like saying in the old version, whenever you have Inspire Courage active, but now it's called Courageous Anthem. So when you have that cantrip active and you damage an enemy with a strike, the spell's duration is extended by 1 round. You can extend an individual casting only once this way. So I believe what they're basically saying here is as long as you can reliably strike and deal damage to your enemies, then you will only need to spend 1 action to cast a Courageous Anthem or Inspire Courage once every 2 rounds, instead of having to spend an action on it every single round. But again, you have to be able to successfully strike and deal damage to an enemy in order to get that benefit. It goes on to say, if you gain the Rallying Anthem or Song of Strength composition cantrips, you can apply this benefit to those cantrips as well. And this is another time where the names have changed a little bit. Rallying Anthem is what used to be known as Inspire Defense. It's now called Rallying Anthem, but if you are a Warrior Muse Bard, then you get that same benefit for Courageous Anthem, for Rallying Anthem, and for Song of Strength. As if you have one of those cast and it's active and you strike and deal damage to an enemy, then it extends the duration of that casting by 1 round, but you can only do that 1 time per casting. So again, I believe the benefit here is that as long as you can reliably hit and deal damage, you will only sacrifice one action every 2 turns on those cantrips instead of once every single turn. All right, so those were a handful of questions that were asked on Reddit and on Patreon. And if you have any questions about them, please feel free to leave those in the comments. If you have any questions that were not touched on in this video, I do plan to do more videos about this. Please leave those in the comments as well. And as always, I want to take a quick moment to say thank you to everybody out there who supports me, whether that's by leaving those questions and comments and suggestions, or clicking the like button, subscribing to this channel, or subscribing to the Patreon. I really appreciate everything you folks do to support me. And with that, thanks for watching, take care, and happy gaming.